Okay, so welcome to consumer training. Have to keep track of what we're doing this day. Okay, so for WSO2, today we're going to kind of focus on the client side of things if you're trying to consume certain APIs. Today we're also going to happen to focus on Eventhub and Python code. We're kind of trying to get a wide variety of code and APIs and trying to cover a lot of bases all at once. So first of all, if you're not aware, SOA is retiring on April 30th. So yeah, I mean, you should be on top of that. So why? Notifications should turn off. That's fun. PowerPoint makes them not turn off. So we got SOASoft retirement for April 30th. What's going away? SOASoft boxes are going to go away. So API calls that are actually going through those boxes will stop working. Those boxes will stop responding after that date. API key nonce authentication, if you've been dealing with that, which I'm sure you have, then that is going away completely, and so is basic auth for API calls. Wow, I'm just bringing it all over. I'm okay right now. Last time I tried to talk and eat, didn't work out so well. And the URLs will be changing. We're still utilizing api.byu.edu as the base URL. If you've dealt with any WS services in the past, we will, as we migrate off of SOA, that will go away. We'll stop using WS at some point in the future, but there's other things going on there for now. And so the URLs will change, but at least 90% of the APIs that were in SOA have already been migrated. We'll show you some tools on how to find what you're looking for and get into all of that. So we'll go over a little bit of what's different between SOA and WSO2. First of all, SOA, I mean, we kind of went over a little bit. Basic auth, API key and nonce, and there were a lot of SOAP and REST APIs altogether. With WSO2, we switched to OAuth 2 as the only accepted authentication mechanism. And we'll go over which flows specifically we support. Almost all of the APIs in WSO2 are now REST. We've largely gotten rid of any SOAP services we had. We had a lot of dead SOAP services in SOA that just weren't being used anymore. And specifically with the case of things like PeopleSoft, for example, has chosen to not migrate any SOAP services into WSO2. They've chosen to only migrate REST. And so there are a couple of places where maybe you used a SOAP service before, it will now be REST. I think I can count on one hand the number of SOAP APIs out of the 600 that exist in WSO2. So
I wouldn't even know how to put a SOAP service into WSO2.
Oh, it's possible. It's easy. WSO2 was originally based on SWEP. No, you use a WSO2. WSO2 was originally based on SOAP, so there's still a lot of old support there. With WSO2, we also move into something we call subscriptions. With SOA, you just got the endpoint and you were able to call the API, and there was never an issue for you, but for us, well, there was never an issue for the consumers at first. But the problem that it causes is the producers of the API have no idea who's calling the API, how much they're using it. We can see a general overview of it got called X number of times in the last whatever dates, but we have no idea who those people are, which causes an issue when the producer wants to change something or something's down. There's no way for the producer to communicate with the client in SOA. So in WSO2, that changes to you as a client have to subscribe to any API that you're going to use. Almost all of those subscriptions are just automatically allowed. There's no approval process. They're just let right through. But the benefit that that gives us is that we know who you are, and there's a direct contact line there. If things need diversion, if things need to change, you're going to be able to get contact information. And if you're not contacted, you can feel free to be upset at the developer because they had the information. So they can't pull the "we didn't know." Along with that, there's an API store. We'll kind of dig into a little bit later. With SOA, very, very few people had access to the actual web interface for SOA. It was mainly used for publishers. And there wasn't a lot of places for any consumer to just dig around at all of the APIs that we produce, which are a lot. So we have an API store now where you're able to dig through, see what APIs are available to you, play around with them a little bit, see what they're responding with, and kind of figure out what you need. And alongside that as well, we have the developer portal, which is new. We'll also dig into that later on, but includes documentation for all these APIs, makes searching for the APIs a lot easier. You're able to search for the data element you want. If you want an API that returns full name, then you're able to search for that and get a list of all the APIs that produce that anywhere in their response codes. And so there's a lot of differences on that side, trying to make things easier for the client to find what they're looking for and to be able to manage what they're dealing with. We'll dig into OAuth 2 a little bit. We're going to kind of go over a brief introduction. I know that pretty much everyone in the room is fairly familiar, but we'll go over this and talk about the flows that we support and when you would want to pick each one of those. So for OAuth 2 in WSO2, we support 4 flows. And you can kind of think of 3 of the flows are really production flows, and we'll get into why. So we support client credentials, authorization code, implicit, and resource owner credentials. Those are standard flows. If you Google them, I mean, they're part of the OAuth 2 specification. You're able to find information about that. We also give you information. We don't expect you to have to go read the horrible spec and all of its, length. You're welcome. So let's touch on each of them real quick. So client credentials is mainly designed to be used for service-to-service communication. If you have any kind of service that doesn't have a user sitting at the keyboard, client credentials is what you want. In OAuth 2 terminology, there's a concept of what's called the resource owner. And in BYU, we've referred to that as a lot of things, like the actor, or the user, whoever is sitting at the keyboard trying to use your application is considered the resource owner. So when you hear us talk about resource owner, that's who we're talking about, is the actual user of the application. So if there is no user of the application, if you've got a batch process that runs in the middle of the night, or you have, a back-end web service that calls another back-end web service, all of those kind of things will use client credentials to authenticate because there just is no user sitting at the keyboard. There's no web browser up. It's super easy to get a token out of client credentials. It's essentially basic auth with the client ID and the client secret, and you're fed back a token. I know there was some confusion that came up last time when I said basic auth, and I just told you that we're getting rid of basic auth. Can't use basic auth to call any APIs. If you try to use basic auth to call an API, it'll just fail. But you utilize basic auth for client credentials to get a token, which is then used to make the API calls. And again, meant for services without a resource owner. That's the easiest way to handle that by far. Authorization code is utilized when there is someone sitting on the keyboard, when there is a resource owner involved. And it involves the web browser quite a bit. Instead of just making a single API call to the back with basic auth to get a token out, you end up doing a series of redirects with the user, which essentially for you only ends up being one redirect. You redirect them to the API management infrastructure, and then they'll get danced around in all of our authentication mechanisms. And we spit back to the application what's called an authorization code. That authorization code is then used with the basic auth from the client ID and secret to actually get fed out what we refer to as a refresh token and an access token. The access token is a valid OAuth token, defaults to having an hour lifetime. And that's what you can use to call APIs involving that user in those calls. Whenever you utilize any of these flows, all of that very first flow is the only one that does not involve the resource owner. All the rest we're going to go over involve a resource owner. And when you have any of these flows, the tokens that come out of these flows will identify to the back end who the user is, who the resource owner is, which will simplify a lot of things greatly as we continue this migration. Now, the refresh token is used for you to be able to get a new access token. So because the access token only lasts an hour, you're able to utilize that refresh token programmatically on the back end, make an API call, and you get fed a new OAuth token for that user. So it makes it so that you don't have to keep redirecting the user every time you need a new token. However, the refresh token is kept secret. It needs to be kept secret. It grants access to get more more access tokens. So you have to be able to treat that as you would your client secret. It has to be kept somewhere secure. Now, implicit grant type is essentially authorization code used for cases where you can't keep the refresh token secure. especially with things like single page apps. It's all in JavaScript. There's no secure backend involved. You can't keep anything secret in JavaScript. So it works identically to authorization code, except for you don't get back a refresh token and you don't get back an authorization code. When the user gets redirected back to your application, in the fragment of the URL, you're just fed an access token directly. There's no extra jumping around with the API management framework. And so if you have a single page app or anything that you just don't want to have to deal with that refresh token on the back end, this is the flow you will use. Now, the downside of that is that because you don't have a refresh token, every hour when that access token expires, you have to redirect the user again. The redirect, as long as their CAS session is still valid, because we authenticate against CAS, it's really fast. The user will barely even notice that they got redirected. I don't even notice it half the time. But it means that your front end just has to have the logic involved with, if they filled out a form and all of a sudden you're out, OAuth token expires, you need to be able to cache that form as you redirect them and then submit when they come back. Just a little bit of extra logic that needs to be done on that front end to make sure that you're able to have an expired token at any given point in time. Resource owner credentials identifies the resource owner in the same way, but it's utilized for applications that capture username and password. We have very few of those across campus, and that's purposefully. This is the one that we would definitely prefer be used only in testing cases. It's a great way for the developers to be able to test with a resource owner involved. If you don't want to have to deal with all of the CAS dance and all of that, you just want to get an access token that involves a resource owner to do some tests, you can do it this way. You essentially just feed the API management infrastructure the username and password, you get spit back a token, and you're good to go.
Isn't this how the mobile would do it?
This is exactly how the mobile app does it today. And in fact, the mobile app is the only production user today. And that's because the mobile app utilizes a couple of other things that they need the username and password for. Eventually, when they can migrate off of those things, they'll switch to authorization code so that they don't have to worry about username and password. And yeah.
Some thick clients, like running on the desktop,
Mm-hmm.
we're trying to move more to a world, because OAuth is taking hold, where the thick clients integrate with the browser.
Uh-huh.
They can still take advantage of auth code or
Exactly.
types. But if for some reason you're writing in a language desktop application that can't interact with the browser, this is what you would do.
Exactly. And yeah, you're definitely able to use this in production. We would just make sure you can't use any of the other types, just because it forces you to have to control a secret at that point, which is the user's password, and that gets dicey sometimes. So as in all the other flows, you won't ever see the user's credentials. We'll handle that for you. You don't have to worry about security around that authentication. Sample code for all of these flow types is available on the developer portal. We'll go over it in just a second. We've currently got sample code in Python, PHP, some .NET. I don't think we have everything in .NET, Java, and we have the implicit grant type for JavaScript, which is pretty much the only flow type you use with just client-side JavaScript. And we do have Node. Did I already say Node? If I didn't, we have Node code as well. So let's go over the API store for a minute. We'll jump back to this in a minute. Wow, my mouse won't move past that point.
Inception.
Thanks, Apple. Oh, now it moves. And my face again. Okay. So when you go to the API store is found at api.byu.edu/store, if you've never been. Anyone who has a net ID and has some kind of primary group, I have to say that because we've said net ID in the past. If someone has an arbitrary net ID and isn't affiliated with the university, they don't get in. It has to do with how our identity infrastructure works on the back end. We just don't propagate net IDs to LDAP unless they're affiliated in some way. So, but anyone who has a net ID essentially will be able to get into the API store. You're able to see all of your applications. you go to my applications page. You'll be able to see all of that there. You'll also be able to see what you're subscribed to, see keys and tokens and all of that stuff. We'll dig into that in a second. But we're going to jump through some of the developer portal first. So if you go to develop, this is our developer portal. We have a lovely countdown that purposely counts down every second to make you feel uncomfortable about the ever-closing date to SOA-Soft retirement. But this is definitely a great landing page. Whenever you're looking for an API, you're looking for any kind of information, any kind of documentation around WSO2 and the new API managers, we've shoved everything here. Everything should be found here. If you come across something that you haven't found, I know Chad has found a couple of cases where we've missed some kind of documentation, please let us know. We want to be able to make sure that this is everything you need. This migration, if you click this little migrate to the API store link, will take you into a whole list of what you need to do, when our trainings are, things like that, to be able to find what you need to do to fully get migrated off of SOA into WSO2. We've tried to document that extensively. One of the great things about this is there's this little lookup tool, which will be super useful as you're going forward to look up, I used to call this service, or I know the old URL that I used to call, what is the new URL? And so you can easily look up things like Eventhub. These are the old SOA-Soft URLs that you would have utilized. Here's the new context for WSO2. This link will take you right out to the store page. Helps you really easily, really quickly find the API you're actually looking for and where you need to go to get subscribed to that and start consuming it. And so all of that is here. Also, if you have any questions as we're going forward, please cut me off and let me know. Chad? Yes.
And so, yeah, I guess before you get too far away from these, with the authorization code method, that redirect, that you said there were multiple redirects, is that just the first time?
Yes. With the authorization code, as long as you have that refresh token, you're able to still refresh off of that, you won't ever have to redirect them again. Okay. That redirect is just for an initial authorization. The user logs in and they come back, you'll be handed that authorization code. And then from then on, as long as you still have that refresh token to utilize, you don't have to refresh.
So what if our application already authenticates them with CAS, and then we need to call the API to get some information about them after they've logged in? Then that would redirect them again.
They won't see the CAS page again.
But it would.
You will still have to redirect, yeah. No matter, even though you've logged them in with CAS, that very first time, they'll have to get bounced through all of the API management infrastructure so that the API management infrastructure knows that they're authorized for your application. Once that comes back and issues you all the tokens, then those tokens are valid, the API manager knows about them, and you won't have to redirect them again. And so does that kind of answer your question? Okay.
Another question.
Yes.
I've heard, or I'm starting to use this acting for header.
Yes.
What context does that work in?
So,
should I be using that?
Yeah, so that's a good thing. We'll kind of go over that real quick. No, I mean, it wasn't very, I figured we'd do that out of band, but it is worthwhile. So in the old SOA infrastructure, you had a concept of an actor. When you asked for a nonce, you could pass in an actor, net ID, and essentially that nonce code you got back when you sent through ended up identifying to the back end as that user you had said you were acting for. It didn't identify as the library or the bookstore or OIT. It identified as whoever you had said it was. That was part of one of the beautiful things about OAuth and being able to finally identify the person at the keyboard is eventually we won't have a need for the actor system anymore. We developed the actor system because we had that need originally. We only had API keys. We had no way to know who was actually sitting at the keyboard. But for now, the actor system isn't going away on April 30th, obviously. So the difference is where you would have before used the actor for the nonce, now we allow that by you setting the acting for header. So you set the acting for header, make a call. WSO2 makes all the same checks we used to make. We check that you're authorized to be able to act for someone, that you're able to act on the API you're calling, And once you are, we format everything so that the backends still see the actor instead of the application. So that still works exactly the same way that it always has, just that we've changed from you passing in the actor when you generate the nonce to setting an acting for header, because we don't generate nonces anymore.
And then would that header work with these different grant types?
It does currently work with all of the grant types. The reason being for that is that we wanted to allow you to, for example, implement authorization code and still use acting for those APIs that haven't quite migrated yet or that you need to do that for, but allow you kind of a migration pattern, because then as those APIs are ready and they've updated, you're able to take off that acting for header and you're already using authorization code. And in fact, on that same note, all of the old web services that used what we called the C framework headers in OIT, and I don't know how familiar you are with those, but essentially that's what the actor system produced. If you use resource owner credentials today, when those get passed through, we actually already identify to the back end that it's the user sitting at the keyboard instead of the application. So if you decide to use authorization code, almost all of the APIs won't require you to use the actor anymore, because we're already doing that automatically. The exception case there are a couple of APIs, for example, some PeopleSoft APIs like YTime, where the user doesn't have self-service access, essentially. So we still have to act for them. The application is still the one with the authorized, that's authorized, not the user. So there are a couple of cases where we will still have to play that in, just because the backend service does not allow the user to have self-service. But if you're going to use authorization code, I would be willing to bet you won't ever have to use the acting for header. Mostly we've left the acting for header there to make it so that you don't have to fully migrate to authorization code off of what you're currently doing before April 30th. We wanted to make sure the migration path was as easy as possible. And so client credentials very closely fits the API key mechanism. And so we wanted that to be the easy flow. But if you're going to go authorization code, you probably won't even ever have to use acting for header, because we're automatically handling that. Does that answer your question? I know there's a whole ton of background information.
We've chosen to, like you said, go with the client credential initially with the acting for, and that was one of the key components that I had missed in reading it up on this stuff. And I don't know.
No,
Missed something?
No, that's totally fine.
And
we've just recently made some of those decisions. And so we're trying to document that and communicate that better. But yes, because you are going that route, you'll use the acting for header, and it'll work the same way it always has for actor. And you just need to make sure that your non-person that was originally authorized gets attached to your new WSO2 application, and yep, it'll just seamlessly work. You won't even notice.
Question.
Yes. Oh, no, you're good. I'm sorry. I thought we were on the last one. You're good.
You said it's now locked down so that not anybody with a net ID, but anybody with a net ID with a primary role.
Yeah. So
has access to that.
I'm not the best person to answer why we don't do or don't put certain people into LDAP.
Well, and it's mostly I'm just curious about. We do have some third party outside of BYU calling our APIs.
Yes.
If we put them into here.
If they have a net ID, I'd say let them try to log in. And if it doesn't work, let me know. And I can work with the identity team. We've had a couple of cases like that. We've got a couple of people up at Idaho. We had to jump through some hoops to get to work. We just had someone recently too. I don't remember who. We had a vendor that we had to do that with. Essentially, the way our identity infrastructure works at BYU is that net IDs are separate from LDAP accounts. There's some amount of checks that have to be passed for the net ID to be migrated into LDAP. WSO2 feeds, you'll see the cast screen, but for authorization checks your groups in LDAP. And so if the user, for whatever reason, hasn't been migrated to LDAP, WSO2 will fail to authorize because it doesn't think the user exists. So I don't even know the straightforward answer, because every time that we have this issue, we have to kind of jump through a different hoop depending on what we're doing. But if you have issues, people can't get in, let me know, and I'm happy to help you work that out.
When you said you have third parties outside of BYU calling your APIs, is it systems that are calling your APIs, or people, or
the one that I can think of is, I would say it's called the system. calling APIs that then print things like theses and dissertations. And they're calling our APIs another company. Yeah, I don't know. I currently don't know how to do it, and I don't think we're going through SOSA. But that was kind of my question. We did put things in. And that's part of producing, I know.
And
that's not much.
we're happy to, whatever your use case is, we'll get it working. We're happy to work with you on it. Because you are probably going to be one of the first people that deals with that extensively. Like I said, we've got some, workings with like BYU Idaho, BYU Hawaii. But those are really our only off-campus consumers currently, or just other CES schools. And so we're kind of working with them on a one-by-one basis, but as you're having issues, we're happy to help you work it out and make it work. We don't want you to have to like bypass WSO2 for them just because they're special. We'll figure it out.
It's possible that the client credentials for that type of handling the use case without any problem.
Yep.
It just depends. We have to get you on the use case. That's more later discussion.
Yeah, that's true.
Alright.
No, you're absolutely welcome. And so, jumping back, if you ever have any questions, come to the developer portal. Look through the documentation. Apparently, we have a horrible color scheme right now. There's a lot of information about that very first thing. Even though you can't read it, it says consume an API, and so we'll try to walk you through. If you're having issues, there's like a little quick start to just be able to consume something. It'll walk you through creating applications, generating keys, all of that kind of stuff. So if you're having issues, definitely look here, see if you can find your answer. If not, we're always happy to help. But we've put a lot of effort into them, hoping that everything is there. In the store, kind of some of those things we walk you through. We walk you through creating the application. We walk you through creating, generating those keys and everything. You'll subscribe here. You can essentially just pick, I want to subscribe with my test API, and pick the tier, which is currently just unlimited. When you pick tiers, it will have a little description down here of what it allows. For the most part, you'll typically always want unlimited subscription if it's provided for you. Bronze provides 1 request a minute, silver provides 5, and gold provides 20 requests a minute. If you have some kind of use case where you as a consumer wants to throttle yourself, you can pick one of those different throttling tiers. Most of the time, though, that's a decision the backend producer makes. If they can't support, a ton of calls all at once or things like that, they'll throttle, and you just won't see the unlimited tier. But 99% of the time, you can just pick unlimited right off the bat. Clicking subscribe will just subscribe you right to it. This API just automatically approved and let through. And now at this point, I am ready to call the Eventhub with those credentials. It's ready to go. There are very few APIs that will ever put your subscription on hold, essentially waiting for an approval. And that's the general use case for that is any API that's currently in development. All of the development APIs will be notifying the development team first before your subscription's allowed through, just because though it's a bad, no, it's always not the best case. We have a lot of times where APIs are being developed and authorization and security are implemented last. And so we don't want people to just be able to make calls for data totally unauthorized and things like that. And then there are also a few select APIs that are restricted, that the producer has decided they want to be able to approve all the subscriptions that come through and only allow certain applications to consume it. YTime being the biggest use case of that currently, just because they license and make agreements with their applications. So, yeah, that's just kind of a really brief overview of the store. We're not going to dig super deep into it. There's a lot of that documentation on the store. I literally would click a button and take a screenshot and take all day to write some of those documents. So hopefully it's in depth.
Just a really quick point here.
Yeah.
This just allows you to call the service. It's not to work with the other entity to get permissions to have data. Right.
Exactly. And Bill's got a good point. This allows you to call the API. The APIs have their own authorization mechanisms on the back end. If you're not authorized, you can call and you may get an error back. We're just essentially allowing you through the API manager door, but you still have to deal with that backend door. We've got a couple of things like Eventhub is going to be our generalized place for requesting elevated privileges. Have you already gone through Eventhub once, Chad?
No.
Okay, I couldn't remember if it was you or if it was one of the other groups that I worked with on campus. Someone that I've helped already get through it. Essentially, Eventhub is going to become the place where we deal with data sharing agreements, DSAs. You'll be able to go into Eventhub, kind of compile your DSA, fill out a form for it, you'll submit it, it'll go through all the processes and get approved, bits will be flipped, and then you'll be notified when you're ready to go. So we link you out from everywhere. From the, if you're looking at an API in developer portal, for example, like we want Eventhub. And we want to look at Eventhub's documentation isn't here, so we should mark that.
Sorry.
Eventhub's documentation is not in the developer portal.
Yeah, it is. Go to docs and then Eventhub. So rest docs right there.
We do, we just don't have it looking like the rest of the Swagger docs. It doesn't have like the links to view in WSO2 and all of that stuff.
Yeah, that's a big project.
Yeah, so I picked a bad API. So we want to look at like person, any kind of, there's a lot of person web services. So for example, persons is the new university API version. We'll link you out to the API store. We'll link you out to Eventhub from here. You're also able to link out to both of those from in the store. We try to link you everywhere from everywhere and help you just kind of get across all of the tools that you'll have to utilize as you go forward. And so jumping into Eventhub will allow you to jump in, see all those things. It's being prettied up. If you need a DSA, we're happy to help you through that process. Eventhub's not quite what they want it to be yet, but so and you're able to see all that API documentation here. We'll feed you all of the endpoints, the actual the methods that you can use to call them. You will see all of your query parameters and options. All of that documentation can be found here on the developer portal in a semi-easy to read fashion. Try to fit a whole ton of information into one document. And so if you have questions about the APIs, you can definitely look here. And then one of the great parts about the API store is that you also have this interactive API console. Both the documentation in the developer portal and this API console are populated by a Swagger document. We've helped work with the developers. The developer portal will update automatically when those Swagger documents are updated in GitHub. And so we're trying to keep the documentation developer portal up to date as much as we possibly can. We've done everything we can. Hopefully the developers can help us with that last little bit. Because we know there's a huge pain with SOA is you'd ask for documentation, and if we found any, it was probably 10 years old. Mm-hmm. And you were lucky if it was 10 years old. And so we've tried to kind of bridge that gap and make it so that the documentation will stay up to date as much as we possibly can and make sure that you're not having that same issue anymore. You can always find the documentation you're looking for. And you're able to play with the API right from the API store. All of these are interactive. You can type in the query parameters, hit try it out, you'll get responses back. This console is formed by the Swagger UI tool that the Swagger group has produced. And it deals with client credentials. It'll always deal with the client credentials OAuth flow. So if you have an API, for example, that for some reason needs a resource owner and stuff like that, the console just won't work. There's just not a good way to handle dealing with resource owner credentials in the console. But that gives you at least some place to kind of play, touch, and make sure your responses are looking right.
You could use
requests.
the resource owner password type with the curl
with the
command,
curl command, yes. And then you could paste the token.
in.
That is true.
So if you have an API that needs a resource owner and you want to test it out through here, you just go up to the API. Want to show them real quick?
Yes. You go to the My Subscriptions page. And we're going to generate keys for this because I will delete them later.
See that curl thing? Pick the top one. and you put in the username and password, identity and password of the user that you want to test with. So it could be your own username and password, or it could be a test user, or whatever you want to do there. It'll give you back a token that then you can put into that try it out page, and it will work.
Yep, and you can also do that for the client credentials as well. It'll just give you a curl command, you paste that in and
But you
go.
don't need to do that in order to use try it out on the other page because it's already there.
Exactly. So, but you can try all of that out right from the API store. One of the other big things about this migration is, with the exception of those few APIs that have changed from like SOAP to REST, we've also had a couple of really, really old APIs. I know that Chad's butted up a couple of those old Pro APIs that we've switched from V1 to V2. There's very few exceptions to that case where the data has changed. So we've updated the version with those. We've switched to REST with PeopleSoft. But in almost all of the rest of the cases, the data has not changed at all. You can still expect your API calls to just come back like they always have. So you don't have to worry about changing your logic in your application to deal with a different data type or any thing like that. 99% of the time, you're going to get the same response that you always have.
Are there any new headers or anything?
You won't get anything new back. I mean, you will. We send a couple of extra headers. WSO2 tacks on a couple extra headers, but nothing that you need to be aware of. You'll get back some where the server went and things like that headers, but nothing that you'll have to be checking for. At least on the producer side, or I mean, at least on the consumer side. On the producer side, we'll have those discussions in another training. But yeah, for your consumption, you can expect the data to come back like it always has. So that is one of those nice things about, we've tried to make this migration as easy as we possibly could. We've worked with all of the legacy services so that they didn't have to update, so that you could continue to consume them. And we're trying to make it so that you have to update as little code as possible to migrate off of SOA. One thing to also keep in mind on this very last is events. The events that you're currently consuming. Right now, probably a good 90+% of the events that we produce across campus produce a callback URL. It's a URL that you can use to call back to get more information about the event or the object that was modified, things like that. Those URLs will be migrating to WSO2. For right now, you're going to have to kind of work with the team that produces the event. We're not managing all of the events migrations, but we're trying to work that out as well to make it as easy as possible for you. But just be aware that eventually that callback URL will be switching to WSO2 as well. So the authorization that you're doing there, that authentication will also have to switch to OAuth 2. But again, should still come back the way it always has. So just something to keep in mind as you're moving forward. So we're going to go over, are there any questions up to this point? Bill, you look just super confused. Just kidding.
You're just talking purely from a consumer perspective right now.
Yeah, I'm trying to focus. I know that this will bring up, write down your publisher questions. I'm happy to answer them after we're done recording.
That's where
But after we're done recording, I'm happy to answer them. We're just trying to make sure we keep the training separate. So we're going to dig through some code. We've got a couple of just Python examples up. One of the things about this training, most of the trainings we've been migrating actual production code from SOA to WSO2. In Python's case, we had zero published production Python services raising events in the Eventhub. So I didn't want to go through and produce it to consume through SOA, so I've only produced it in WSO2, so you won't see what changed, but you'll at least be able to see examples of how it's working today through WSO2. You're able to see all of that, and BYU OIT app dev. Then I don't even remember what I called it all of a sudden. BYU OIT app dev. And Python Eventhub examples. I've got a couple examples in here right now. I plan to continue to flesh that out on any other kind of consumption that you're dealing with the Eventhub. But for right now, we've got calling just one of the normal REST endpoints, like get event types, just dealing with some documentation type stuff. And then also being able to raise an event through WSO2. So we can look here. It's fairly simple. There is this, I dug a lot to try to find an OAuth library I liked in Python. There's a lot of weird ones. There's a library that's called WSO2 that when you actually go to the documentation page says this implements OAuth 1, not OAuth 2. I don't know why on earth they called it OAuth 1.
And some of them are
But-
like specific to a particular grant
Yeah,
type.
some of them are specific. You also have a lot of them. There's a lot of them that are very specific to dealing with like Google, Facebook type OAuth flows where you're never concerned with your own credentials. You're only concerned with the user's credentials. The one that I found that I liked the best was requests_OAuth lib. It plays along really nicely with requests.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, it plays along really nicely. And it's very, I say bare bones, but in a good way. It provides a simple API to do what you need to do, but without totally abstracting you to the point that it only works in a specific use case. So you're able to piece all of those pieces of the puzzle together. The one thing to keep in mind is that, I don't know, I didn't end up digging through their source code. Both of these examples use client credentials because in most cases for raising events, client credentials is the flow we would use. A user doesn't usually raise the event. But whatever the library does by default to try to authenticate against the client credentials token endpoint is not correct, or is not what WSO2 expects it to do. In their documentation, they say if you use basic auth to authenticate, do this, and we use basic auth to authenticate for client credentials. So you essentially set up just HTTP basic auth from requests, and you just tack that onto the auth in the auth call. Like I said, I didn't dig in to see what they're actually
There's
doing
an
for
easier
authentication.
way. Like you can pass it in a tuple to the auth argument. You can just pass the username, comma, password in a tuple.
Yeah, I don't know what they're doing with that auth because this is what their documentation said I had to do.
Right. But
So,
that's
but
what the tuple does underneath the hood.
I see.
Same thing.
So you probably could just deal with it that way. But essentially, I'm able to set up a backend application client, which is what they call client credentials. And it sets up a session for it, which there isn't a session. It's just part of their flow. And then we fetch the token out, and we're good to go. This token actually ends up getting set to a dictionary of all of the things it gets back. So you're able to access how many seconds left until it expires. It also actually calculates the timestamp of when it will expire, which is really nice because you can always just check, have we passed that expiry endpoint instead of having to like keep a ticker of the number of seconds it's been. You can just check, have we passed, have we passed, have we passed. And then I'm able to just set that call for all OAuth tokens are set in the authorization header with the type being bearer. That's how the OAuth token is utilized. So when you get an OAuth token back from any of the flows, you'll just have this one string that's your token. And no matter how you got that token, you just set it to authorization bearer space the token. And that's all WSO2 needs to be able to get through. I said a couple of extra things here because I wanted JSON instead of the Eventhub defaults to XML. And so I wanted to see JSON. But then I'm able to post that event. We just set a static event body here that's just publishing to the domain, edu BYU, entity WSO2 training, and the event type is heartbeat. It's just hello world. And we're able to publish that and then fish out of that response to check if we were able to successfully raise the event or not. And it does actually work.
Prove it.
I'll prove it. So we can run Python 3 raise. Cool, it doesn't. Oh, it's because I took out my client ID and password. Yay, I was smarter than my current self. Huh?
Those ones that you've already linked on the video anyways.
That's what I'm going to do.
Just refresh. Yeah, it's already there.
Yep, I know. except for this isn't the client that I registered the event with. So Braden's going to delete his default application again following this. This will be the like 5th time.
Been really good at that.
You'd think I'd learn. I don't.
It's a good thing,
Okay, so if we say
Just note
that.
for the lives, don't link your AWS keys to GitHub.
Yeah, bad idea.
Just
And on that same note, if you do leak your WSO2 credentials, the client ID is a public identifier. You're free to publish that, put that, wherever. It's not gonna be secret. But the secret is secret. That's why we call it secret. If you happen to leak that, the only way to regenerate client token or client credentials, you'll see this regenerate button right here, but all that does is regenerate the current valid access token. The only way to get rid of this access key and secret is you have to delete the application, recreate.
And then subscribe it to everything.
And then resubscribe to everything. So it's not super easy. We kind of are purposefully leaving it that way because we'd like to not make it easy for you to leak your credentials.
Subscribe it to everything, update your code, then delete it.
Yeah.
That way it doesn't fall out.
Yes. So, and you'll obviously want to move your authorizations from the one client ID to the other, but that is the only way to regenerate those.
Yeah, if there is one. Yeah.
So now if we try to raise an event, we'll get event raised successfully. Yay. So we're able to raise that event. And then we can also get back, for example, all of the event types. So we'll dig through this code real quick. I can make it bigger. Is that like, does anyone else think the projector looks fuzzy in here? So essentially the exact same thing. We go through that exact same dance to get back a token. But then in this case, there was just less logic involved. There's no big event. We set that bearer token. And again, so that token is actually an object of, or dict of, it has access token, refresh token if you happen to have one in your flow, expires in, expires at, blah, blah, blah. So I wanted the actual access token there. Just call a get request on that and parse through those events to format them for a print. And we're able to, what did I do? Oh, not save my credentials. And not save a single quote. Guys, I'm on a roll today. And so we're able to get out all of the event types and format them. And just to kind of give a quick example of, interacting with any of the other, Eventhub produces a lot of APIs, which most consumers don't ever use besides either publishing, or if you receive a webhook, you just receive the webhook and don't ever interact with the Eventhub on a regular basis at all, besides to set up that subscription. But it's really easy to deal with. Are there questions about the code?
I think it's awesome.
Like I said, the request auth-lib was by far the best Python library I found to deal with that.
But you also need auth-lib itself. Is that just another library?
This gets imported from this. I need to change this and see if it actually changes anything, because this is how they have it documented and like this at the same time in their documentation. It's funny, but it's like my
application client on line 18.
Well, I meant like, because these both, this request underscore OAuth-lib and just OAuth-lib apparently get imported by the same, because this is all that my requirements are.
Okay, so it's a dependency of
it's a dependency of request OAuth-lib or something like that. Because it gets pulled in from some kind of somewhere. I don't know where they're
Would
pulling
you
it.
mind just quickly trying if we could switch line 20 of the auth to a tuple with the username with the client ID and client secret there? See if that works. Okay, yeah, so we could get rid of line.
Yeah, so this line can just go away.
17 and 6.
That'll still work. So you just have to get basic auth in. Whatever they're doing for their default auth there is not how we deal with it on BYU. But they're both valid and they document for both cases. But yeah, that request auth lib was the easiest to deal with. Just because of its ability to be composable. A lot of the other ones were very tight.
Other access types, you know, you said this backend.
So it does actually deal with, we can actually dig into it real quick. It does implicit and client and auth code. I'm pretty sure it actually did all of them. So it will deal with, they call them weird things. I'm not really sure why they chose that, but authorization code is web application, implicit is mobile, resource owner password is legacy, and client credentials is backend. So they actually deal with all 4 that we support.
I wish they wouldn't rename them though.
I know. I don't.
So many different
I think that was the
words.
weirdest thing I've ever. Because I actually looked at it as like,
Maybe
I don't know, backend. I mean, luckily with client credentials, there's only like one option for that. You know, backend was the one that seemed most.
Maybe they're just trying to help you understand.
Maybe it was a weird. Because web application doesn't always use auth code, and
Right.
the mobile app, our mobile app doesn't even use implicit. So
resource owner password.
Yeah.
And some mobile apps will use implicit. And
Exactly.
Some web apps.
But it will allow you to do a lot of all of those flows. Their documentation is actually pretty decent, and it's fairly basic to get a token out of what you're trying to deal with, as long as you can fish it the right mechanisms. And it was actually, and now I'm trying to remember if it's this library I looked at or another library. No, yeah, it is this library. So they'll essentially, when you do have like resource owner, sorry, not resource owner credentials, when you have authorization code or implicit grant type, the library is able to fish you out like the authorization URL redirect and all that kind of stuff. So you essentially say, here's where I am. It'll feed you back out a state and an authorization URL, and you redirect and it'll keep track of state and stuff like that. And so it seemed to handle those redirects fairly well as well, if that's what you're going to do.
It's nice that it's built into requests because then it can deal with, you know, the application specific stuff for HTTP requests.
Exactly.
Like Node does by default because there's only one way to do it.
Yep.
In Python, request is the default library for that. So that's
Yeah. Yeah. And so that is really nice that they handle it. And like I said, they use requests in the OAuth lib. So you can actually dig into this OAuth lib if you really want to just use the very basic stuff. Which granted, I mean, for this client credentials, almost everything we used was from this. We use, I guess, only this part. Ignore what I stated, because I forgot that this line actually does come from their requests library. So it makes all of that really easy, but it does bring in some of the stuff from the OAuth lib. So, and yes, personally, I love requests. So it made it really nice to work with. And if you happen to have an OAuth 1 client, you can use it. We don't support OAuth 1, just in case that was, we only support OAuth 2. Other questions thus far? Okay. Like I said, feel free to go dig into this example code online. We've also got Python examples for all of the auth flows. They don't use any OAuth libraries. They're just the raw request calls.
Is there authorization code grant type example uses state parameter?
Yes.
That's state parameter. Any authorization code, you really need to use state parameter because it prevents cross-site forgery attacks.
Yeah.
And so there's a one-on attack. You don't have that.
Yeah. So we can actually look at it right here. In their web application flow, they'll generate you a random state and the URL that's tacked on. So essentially the state is you generate some kind of secret that gets passed back to you, and you just check that they still match. And so it does all of that logic for you, feeds you the state and the authorization URL.
Statements would be essentially random for each authorization code flow, so that somebody can't predict what it's going to be, and then basically forge a request, is that initial redirect, and have your client follow the redirects and hand it back a authorization code that you can use to get a token. So there is a specific attack that can be used against WSO2 without that statement.
Yeah, exactly. And so this will help you deal with that, which is, again, one of the reasons WSO2 will only respond to HTTPS. If you try to call through HTTP, you're going to get an error. We've blocked that out in the reverse proxies. It was not intentional originally, but we purposefully left it that way because OAuth 2, security of OAuth is totally based on the assumption that things are happening over HTTPS. A lot of stuff is passed in plain text as query parameters and stuff like that. So when there's not HTTPS, you're just opening the door to all of that. And so all of that stuff is able to be grabbed in flight, which is why the state, as long as we're in HTTPS, isn't going to be grabbed and dealt with. So yes, I'll keep expanding this out as we'll do a couple more things like dealing with the consumption of the webhook and stuff like that with the Eventhub, because we're trying to put together both examples for Python and examples for the Eventhub consumption. But if you have any problems or any kind of issues as you're going through this, feel free to reach out. I'm happy to help go through all of that. So yeah. You good, Bill? Okay. And
Look on my face, just my comment.